The Hadza, the most primitive tribe living on Earth. They survive by hunting their food with bows and arrows just like our ancestors did thousands of years ago. They chase rock hyraxes, antelopes, and baboons.
The first thing I learned after spending 3 days with the Hadza was that the hardest part of hunting them was not finding the animals. It was finding them before the darkness found us. By the end of our hunt, we had followed tracks, crossed dry ground, waited in silence, and tried to predict where our prey would move next. The hunters knew the land in a way I had never experienced. They noticed details I would have walked straight past. And still, when night came, the animals escaped. If you enjoy travel stories where reality is very different from what you expect, subscribe, because I still hadn't understood what I had walked into. Before arriving in Tanzania, I imagined the Hadza lifestyle as something almost impossible for a modern person to understand. They are one of Africa's best-known hunter-gatherer peoples, living around the Lake Eyasi region and maintaining traditions centered on hunting, gathering, mobility, and detailed knowledge of their environment. I arrived expecting to learn how people could survive without the conveniences I had taken for granted my entire life. I didn't expect those conveniences to become the thing that made me feel helpless. On my first morning, the day began with movement. The hunters prepared their handmade bows and arrows, checked what they needed, and began searching for signs of animals. I kept looking for an obvious trail. They didn't. A bent piece of vegetation mattered. A mark in the ground mattered. A change in the direction of footprints mattered. At first, I thought they were guessing. Then one of the hunters stopped and examined the ground. A few seconds later, the group changed direction. I couldn't see what he had seen. That was my first major lesson. Survival knowledge doesn't always look like knowledge when you don't understand the language of the landscape. I also discovered that my idea of food was completely different from theirs. There was no refrigerator waiting at the end of the day, no supermarket. Food was something you found, collected, hunted, or sometimes went without. Water was just as important. At one point, I saw the group using muddy-looking water, and my immediate reaction was that I would never drink it. I had grown up treating clean, clear water as normal. I didn't think about water treatment when I turned on a tap. Here, water was something you had to find and understand. That moment made me realize how much modern infrastructure protects me without me even noticing. I didn't think about where food came from when I opened a package. I didn't think about how much technology was quietly doing for me every day. The Hadza lifestyle forced me to think about all of it. But the biggest surprise came when I realized hunting wasn't simply about being strong enough to kill an animal. It was about patience. It was about reading evidence. It was about knowing when an animal had passed through an area, where it might go next, and how human movement could change its behavior. That became especially important when the hunt for baboons began. The first stage was almost impossible for me to follow. The hunters searched for signs, moved carefully, and watched the terrain. I kept expecting the dramatic moment when we would suddenly see the animals. Instead, most of the hunt was waiting and tracking. That was harder than I expected. I could walk for hours and feel like nothing was happening. The hunters didn't. They were constantly gathering information, the direction of movement, the condition of tracks, the places the animals might have passed, the distance between us and the prey. Every small discovery changed the next decision. Then we found stronger evidence that the baboons were nearby. Suddenly, this no longer felt like a demonstration. This was a real hunt. I was watching people use skills passed down through generations to solve a problem I would have had no idea how to approach. But then came the first major reversal. The baboons weren't simply waiting to be caught. They were watching us, too. The longer the hunt continued, the more I understood that the animals were part of the calculation. They knew the terrain. They could move quickly. They could climb. And unlike us, they didn't have to worry about keeping a group of humans together. We followed their movements, lost them, found signs again, and kept going. By the end of the first day, we had failed. I assumed the next day would be easier. It wasn't. The second day taught me something important about survival. Having the right skills doesn't guarantee success. It only improves your chances. The hunters could read tracks better than I could. They moved through the terrain with confidence and understood animal behavior in ways I was only beginning to appreciate. But the baboons had advantages of their own. And the longer we hunted, the more those advantages mattered. We kept searching, and every failed attempt created another problem. Time, energy, distance, darkness. For me, darkness usually means returning somewhere safe, turning on a light, checking a phone, and knowing exactly where I am. Here, darkness changed the rules. As the light disappeared, I became increasingly aware of how dependent I was on modern technology. I needed to see where I was stepping. I needed to know where I was going. I needed to know what was around me. The hunters didn't have those comforts, yet they understood something I didn't. There are moments when continuing a hunt becomes more dangerous than admitting the hunt is over. That was one of the most surprising things I witnessed. The goal wasn't simply to prove that the hunters could catch the animals. The goal was to survive. And sometimes survival meant accepting failure when the conditions changed. By the third day, I had stopped expecting the dramatic ending I imagined before the trip. I thought perhaps we would finally get the animal. Instead, the final lesson was much more uncomfortable. The baboons escaped. After everything we had followed, all the tracking, movement, and effort, we returned without the result we wanted. And that failure was exactly what made the experience unforgettable. The animals had exploited something incredibly simple: human limitations. We needed visibility. We needed to manage our movement. We needed to conserve energy. We needed to work within the limits of the group. The baboons didn't care about any of that. They used the darkness and terrain to create distance between themselves and the people pursuing them. I had arrived thinking the story would be about humans mastering nature. Instead, I watched something much more complicated. The hunters understood their environment extraordinarily well, but understanding nature doesn't mean controlling it. That changed the way I thought about the Hadza. Before the trip, I imagined survival as a collection of impressive skills: making a bow, tracking an animal, finding water, identifying food, and moving through difficult terrain. After 3 days, I understood that survival also meant knowing your limits, knowing when to move, when to wait, when to continue, and when to stop. The biggest mistake I could have made was assuming that a successful hunter must always come home with an animal. Sometimes the knowledge is in understanding why the animal escaped. There was another thing I couldn't stop thinking about after I left. I had spent 3 days without many of the comforts I considered normal, and every hour made me more aware of how much modern life does for me without asking for my attention. Clean water appears. Food appears. Light appears. Transportation appears. Communication appears. If something goes wrong, there is usually a system somewhere designed to help. The Hadza way of life has historically depended far more directly on knowledge of the environment, cooperation, adaptability, and access to what the land provides. And yet, after watching the hunt fail, I couldn't honestly say they were helpless without modern comforts. In some ways, I was the helpless one. Remove my phone, my maps, my familiar food, my easy access to water, and my ability to call for help, and I suddenly had very few answers. The hunters had answers I didn't have, but even they couldn't force the baboons to cooperate. That is the part of those 3 days that stayed with me. I went to see people who had preserved an ancient way of life. I expected the biggest lesson to come from watching them succeed. Instead, it came from watching them fail. They tracked the animals. They understood the terrain. They adapted again and again. And still, the prey escaped into the darkness. I left with more respect for how difficult survival really is, but also with one question I still can't completely answer. If people can spend generations learning to read a landscape this closely, how much knowledge have modern societies lost simply because we no longer need to use it every day? And when technology disappears, how much of what we think we know about survival will actually remain? I don't know. Maybe that's why I still think about those 3 days. If you were in my position, would you rather have the technology you depend on every day, or the survival knowledge that comes from generations of living directly from the land? Tell me your theory in the comments. Share this story with someone who would find it fascinating, and subscribe for more journeys where the reality is never quite what I expect.